Today we're unboxing a 5th generation iPad that should be running its original software version, iOS 10. This was actually sent to me inside an original iPad box. So hopefully this wasn't a mix-up and we actually have our 5th generation iPad inside. Okay, so we have a note here that says under this plastic, so we'll remove that. And yes, it looks like we do see our 5th generation iPad. Definitely some creative packaging from this seller. Taking a look at the iPad itself here, it appears to be in really good condition, just quite a bit of fingerprints. And we do have the gold color option. I'm really not finding any wear across the device, so it should clean up perfectly. Let's get it powered up to see if it's actually running iOS 10. And cool, we boot into the language selector here, but I can definitely tell this is iOS 10 by the battery icon in the top right. So this is a much thinner battery outline than we got in iOS 11 and newer. But maybe by locking the device here, we can get back to the hello screen, and yes. So this hello screen is actually exclusive to iOS 10. And the big giveaway for that is just the thinner hello font here in the middle of the screen. This was changed to a much thicker hello font in iOS 11. So we'll go ahead and press the home button to start the setup. We are getting a prompt here in the setup for Touch ID, so we'll confirm that the sensor is working. And yes, it appears to be working without any issue. And perfect, there we go. We are met with the iOS 10 home screen. So let's go into settings to find out specifically which version of iOS 10 we have. And awesome, we have 10.3 here. So I believe that was the very first version available for this iPad, as it was released in early 2017, about halfway into iOS 10's life cycle. We can also see that this is the top-end 128GB model. So that's really cool. A good majority of these are the base model 32GB. So I'll take a second now to get this iPad all cleaned up, and then we'll take a closer look at it. Okay, well, I gave the iPad a really nice cleaning and gave it some time to fully charge up. It came out looking really well. I could only find some very tiny scratches in the screen. And the body here is also looking really good, and I'm super glad to have the gold color option. I connected this to my Mac to find the battery health. And using the coconut battery application, I was able to find out that this has over 100% battery health. And it reports 0 cycles on this battery, so it definitely appears that this iPad was never used. So now let's talk about what this 5th generation iPad was. So this was Apple's new base model iPad released in March of 2017. And that was pretty significant for the iPad lineup, as there had not been just a standard model iPad in the lineup since the 4th generation was discontinued in 2014. This 4th generation had originally been released back in 2012. We would see the original iPad Air join the lineup in 2013 as the new flagship model. And throughout 2015 and 16, we would receive 2 sizes of the iPad Pro. So it was just an odd transitionary period where the iPad was getting a lot of new models. Of course, throughout all of that, the iPad mini was also an option. But for a more budget-oriented iPad shopper, Apple had always just kept an older model available at a discounted price. So in early 2017, just before this model was released, the iPad Air 2 was acting somewhat as the budget option. It was priced at $399, but the product itself was getting to be a little bit old. It was originally released in late 2014. But when this 5th generation base model was released, it made the lineup make a lot more sense. It was priced really affordably at $329. And this iPad kind of felt similar to what Apple did with the 2016 iPhone SE, by reusing a previous model's physical design but upgrading the internals and adding some new features. So this 5th generation base iPad shared most of its design with the 2013 1st generation iPad Air. As you can see, these two have the exact same footprint. There was an updated speaker design though, with only a single row of cutouts. There was no longer a physical switch for the mute or rotation lock. There was also now a Touch ID sensor included on the home button. Some aspects of the 5th generation though were more similar to the Air 2. So the 5th generation had an 8 megapixel rear camera like the Air 2. And as you can see, that button and speaker design was more similar to the Air 2. But the Air 2 here was significantly thinner and noticeably lighter than the 5th generation. And the display on the 5th generation didn't have as many premium qualities as the Air 2. The Air 2 had a laminated display with an anti-reflective coating, so there was no air gap between the cover glass and the actual display panel. And the anti-reflective coating kind of had a purple or blue tint, but it really did help cut down on reflections. So it was noticeably a step down that the 5th generation did not include those qualities. It wasn't one of those things that was going to make a huge difference in your day-to-day usage. It's kind of hard to explain, but where this display was not laminated, the content on it did not feel as immersive. And it also made for a more hollow sound when you would tap on the screen. Also, one more point about the design, the 5th generation removed the diamond chamfered edge that was present on the Air 1 and Air 2. The display panel itself on this iPad was pretty much the same as Apple had been using for many years. So it measured 9.7 inches diagonally with a resolution of 2048 by 1536. And this iPad received the same processor as the iPhone 6s. So that was the A9 chip, which was paired to 2 gigabytes of RAM. It was not the newest chip available at the time though. That would have been the A10 Fusion from the iPhone 7. This 5th generation iPad was only sold for 1 year, being replaced with the 6th generation in 2018. That model did receive the A10 Fusion chip, as well as, most importantly, support for the Apple Pencil. But the 5th generation here received software support through iOS 16 in 2022. And iOS 16 is still relatively current, as it has received some recent security updates. So if you own one of these 5th generation models, it's still somewhat usable in 2025 for basic tasks. It's really interesting because despite this model being powered by the same chip found in the iPhone 6s, the 6S and other A9 devices ended their software support with iOS 15 instead of 16 like the 5th generation. So this model is definitely an example of one of those arbitrary software support decisions that Apple has been known to make. And now let's take a second to talk about iOS 10 on this iPad specifically. So this was the first version to remove the classic slide to unlock feature. Instead, it was replaced with press home to open, as sliding on the lock screen now brought up this new widget view. You could also find those widgets when swiping left on the home screen, and also when doing so in the notification center. And this version brought some new sounds. So there was a new lock sound, and here's a comparison to the lock sound with iOS 9. There was also a new typing sound for the keyboard. And here's that compared to iOS 9. Also, this version had a really distinct control center. So as this splash screen here was informing us, there was now 3 pages to the control center. There was a main screen here, as well as audio and, if available, your smart home accessories. I always thought the design of this control center was pretty cool, but I understand that Apple had to change it in iOS 11 to align better with the iPhone X's design. Also new for iOS 10 was the ability to delete system applications, which would just basically hide them. And in general, this version just had some interesting animations. So for opening and closing applications, I believe the look on this version was unique. There was also a new look for opening a folder, so we'll go ahead and create one now. As you can see, the whole background would blur and the folder would just kind of zoom. With iOS 9, we had a different effect. The Home application was new for this version, and for the later versions of iOS 10, the TV application replaced the classic Videos app. On the iPad, you can now have split view tabs in Safari. So just holding the tab button, you could press Open Split View. Websites don't really load perfectly on iOS 10 because the version is so outdated, but you get the idea. Also, in the way of multitasking, you retain the split view and slide over functionalities from iOS 9. So we'll go into the calendar here, and you can easily turn that into split view. But iOS 10 was the last version for iPads where you had this older style dock. iOS 11 was a pretty big upgrade for the iPad with a more Mac OS style dock and a Files application. Let's go into settings and check out the default wallpapers here on iOS 10. So you did retain the dynamic category that had launched with iOS 7. These were pretty cool. They would have moving dots based on the tilt of your device. Unfortunately, the stills category on this version was pretty boring. There were only 15 here to choose from, and all but one was carried over from previous versions. So the only new one was the green wave default for iOS 10. We also had the blue sand default from iOS 9, as well as the purple kind of galaxy from iOS 8. None of these really speak to me, so I think I'm just going to leave the iOS 10 default. I do think the green in this wallpaper does look good with the gold iPad. We'll also take a look at Siri on this version. I really like the icon for Siri with iOS 10. Tell me a joke.
People often accuse me of being a plagiarist. Their words, not mine.
And that is Siri on iOS 10. A pretty cool look here with these blurred colors that kind of move. We'll also check out the App Store on this version. So everything does still load, so I will be able to download a nice selection of games and applications. Of course, not anything like YouTube or social media, as it's too outdated for that. But definitely things like Temple Run and Grand Theft Auto. And thankfully with 128 gigabytes, I will not be pressed for space. I'll also definitely get my iTunes library synced to this. But Apple Music also still works on iOS 10, so I could sign in with that if I wanted to. So that pretty much concludes my look at this 5th generation iPad running its original software version, iOS 10.3. I forgot to mention I actually owned one of these when it was relatively new back in 2018, so I still have the box here. But leave me your thoughts on this iPad below. Do you think it was actually a compelling value or just kind of a parts bin thrown together model? Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.